All right. This is where we left off in the book last week. I don't know how to do this other than or perhaps to go through the book and elaborate as to what is in the book. I'm constantly adding and tweaking the book here a little bit here and there. And I'm trying to come up with maybe I can finish it this summer. I want to deal with what's called source criticism because the atheists use this, and I want this material to be a source to deal with atheism. And I believe we're surrounded by it in the United States. I believe our educational system is filled with it, and we need to be able to answer them and try to convert these people and get them to become Christians. So we're going to look here, and hopefully I can get that in the book, and we'll be pretty well through with what I want to have in the book. I may add a little bit here and there, but by and large, it'll be pretty much finished. We asked this question here regarding the books of the Bible. We looked at archaeological evidence. It confirms historical accuracy. Why do we want to confirm the historical accuracy? If the Bible is historically accurate, it's accurate as to customs and other things, then it was written in the time frame which it purports to have been written. Now, I illustrated this last week with the fact that the American Civil War, my great-grandfather fought in the American Civil War. One of my great-grandfathers did. And so that's not that far removed from us. My older brother knew him. So the American Civil War, there have been books written about it, and they had to be corrected. These are history books, and the history historians did research, and yet their research was flawed, and they're doing fairly good research, but it was flawed, and the archaeologists began to dig and find some more information, and they had things wrong. So there were things that they had wrong in their thinking about the American Civil War. I'm not talking about the reasons for them. I'm talking about where battles occurred and things that happened and various things. And what we have is, if in 200 years or so, they got things wrong and they had real good research techniques, how in the world can these people get things right 3 or 4, 500 or 1,000 years after it occurred? Now, the claim is made that the book of Genesis was written and Exodus were written 300 BC or 400 BC, somewhere thereabouts. Some make that claim, or maybe 450 BC. And yet that's in a time frame, it's nearly 2,000 years after it occurred. Some of the events occurred in the book of Genesis. And I'm talking about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, what I'm talking about. And particularly, we're going to look at Genesis 37:27 here. In this passage of scripture, we have a slave, a man named Joseph, who's sold into slavery. Now, this is an interesting point as we look at it. Genesis 37:28. He was sold for 20 shekels of silver. And was that the right price for a slave at that time? The Biblical Archaeology Review has a graph in it, and I cite it right here on the bottom of the screen, in the middle of the screen, volume 21, number 2, 1995, page 53. There's a graph for the price of a slave back then from the archaeological evidence over time. The common price for a slave had gone from 10 to 30 to 15 to 30 shekels of silver about the time of Moses. But later, they're more expensive. In Hosea 3:2, a slave was worth about 30 shekels of silver. That's what they sold for. And yet Joseph is sold for 20 pieces of shekels of silver. Now, Kitchen, in his book, archaeological book he cites, pages 52 to 53, he argues and gives evidence in 1800 BC, whenever Joseph went into Egypt, this was the price for a slave of the caliber of Joseph, a young slave of his age and his caliber. Centuries earlier, there were 10 shekels and then 15 shekels. And this is laid out in this research. And there were 30 shekels about the time of Moses. And later, they're more expensive. Now, Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver, so 30 pieces of silver, 30 coins, silver coins, and by his betrayer, Judas Iscariot. And of course, the prophets said he would be sold for that. That would be the price. But Hosea 3:2, 30 shekels of silver was the price of a slave. And centuries earlier, it had been 10, 15, and even 30, 20 and 30. So he was sold at the right price. And how did he get it right? Thing after thing like this is found in the scriptures. And yet this is something that they just couldn't have guessed on and got it right. Right? So this is one kind of thing. And I'm not going to elaborate and give you a bunch more. There's some books that have been written, excellent books, that give arguments for this kind of argument here that I'm making here. I'm just sampling it, just a sample. I'd encourage you to get some of these books and you can use them to show. And the proof is, we want to prove that the scriptures were written when they're purported to have been written. And then the prophecies that are in them prove that they're from God. And that's why they have to attack this. The atheists do. And they have to attack it in the source, the time, and who wrote the book of Genesis, for example, and when he wrote it. And they have to make an attack upon this because the prophecies are too powerful. Atheists, agnostics, and skeptics also commit this fallacy, along with another fallacy. Now, what fallacy are we talking about? Let's back up a minute here. We've seen some fallacies here, and they argue that we have the fallacy of affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. These are the fallacies we're looking at. So these are the fallacies we're looking at here that we've seen people committing. Atheists and skeptics also commit another fallacy, appeal to ignorance. Let me illustrate. Here's an argument that you'll hear made. And I use John Doe just for any person, a fictitious person. If Christian John Doe, and assume we got some Christian named John Doe, can answer argument X made by an atheist, then argument X made by an atheist has an answer. Well, that's self-evident. That's axiomatic. If he can answer it, then there's an answer to it. All right. Christian John Doe cannot answer argument X made by an atheist, so we can't answer it. Well, that's possible. An atheist may make an argument some Christian can't answer. That's possible. And I would assume that there are arguments that are made by atheists that some Christians can, particularly younger Christians, and those who haven't studied and reasoned and had a good education in the scriptures might not be able to answer it. Well, that doesn't prove anything because argument X made by the atheist has no answer. That's the claim they make. Well, that would only be true if he was dealing with God, an omniscient being. Right? But the argument is a fallacy of denying the antecedent. Right here, the antecedent, John Doe can answer argument X made by an atheist. And he says he can't answer it, cannot answer it. He denies the antecedent. And that argument proves absolutely nothing. This conclusion is worthless. It's totally worthless. Not worth the paper it's printed on. Okay. Now, let me illustrate this. Here's another example. Of course, it's also a fallacy of appealing to ignorance, which we'll get to later when we study logical fallacies. just because I'm ignorant of something doesn't mean there's not an answer to it. I remember when I was in high school, I didn't even know what the word calculus meant. Whenever I got in college, I had to take several courses in it. And but I was totally ignorant of calculus when I was in high school. I took algebra and geometry and all the math that they taught in the high school, but they didn't teach calculus in my little high school. But I had heard the word somewhere, but I didn't have any concept of what it's all about. So, yes, you may be ignorant of something, but that doesn't mean that your ignorance proves that what someone says about it is true, or even someone denies about it is false. Here's one right here, Barry Brown, a man named Barry Brown. He committed this fallacy because he wrote, here's what he wrote. He wrote that Israeli archaeologist Eliezer Oren searched for 10 years, and he quotes, here's a quote now, he failed to provide a single shred of evidence that the biblical account of the Exodus from Egypt ever happened. So he searched for 10 years, couldn't find a shred of evidence that it happened. Not one shred of evidence. All right, now you think that's a pretty weighty argument. And this newspaperman thought it was powerful enough. He just thought it proved that the Exodus didn't occur. Well, let's look at his argument. If there's archaeological evidence of several million Israelites both camped and died in the wilderness during the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, if that's true, if that is true, then it occurred. If there's evidence of it, then it had to occur. Well, that's obvious. That's true. If there's evidence of it, archaeological evidence, and I'm talking about good, sound archaeological evidence, then it occurred. We know it occurred. And then we say, well, there's no archaeological evidence. And that's what he claimed. There's no archaeological evidence that this occurred. Therefore, he concluded that the 40 years of wilderness wanderings did not occur. That's his conclusion. It didn't occur. That's his argument. But of course, the problem with it, he takes his antecedent, and I'll highlight the antecedent. All right. And right here, he takes that archaeological evidence and he argues that this did not occur. I'll be back in just a moment. So we have his antecedent. His antecedent is denied, and that's a logical fallacy. And that doesn't prove the consequence not true. We've already shown this. And he's got a problem with his argument. There's an additional problem here. There's some evidence that Mount Sinai was located on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba instead of the traditional side on the west side of the Gulf of Aqaba. The only body of water that the scriptures ever explicitly located called the Red Sea, or what we now call the Gulf of Aqaba, 1 Kings 9:27. So let's look at 1 Kings 9:27. Here's what it says. I'll read verse 27. And Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen that had knowledge of the sea, with the servants of Solomon. And they came to Ophir and fetched from thence golds 430 talents and brought it to King Solomon. So now he had ships here, and his ships here. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 8:17 and see more about his ships. 2 Chronicles 8:17. And in this right here in 8:17, then went Solomon to Eliezer to Eloth on the seashore of the land of Edom. All right. So right here, he has his ships coming, and this is Ezion Geber, right? This is on the shore, right near the seashore in the land of Edom. And the land of Edom would be right on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, right? Now, 1 Kings 9:26, we see here, and let's read verse 26. I read 27 a moment ago. And King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion Geber, which is beside Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. It's called the Red Sea. So it is the Red Sea. Ezion Geber is on the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's on the Red Sea. The only body of water that's ever called the Red Sea is what we now call the Gulf of Aqaba. That's the only body of water that's ever called in the Bible, the Red Sea. So right here, then, we see that this is on the Gulf of Aqaba is the Red Sea. It's identified as it. Nowhere else is any other body of water ever called the Red Sea in the Bible. Now, then, I understand that this doesn't prove that this is the only body of water. It could have been the whole entirety, what is called the Gulf of Suez, is also part of the Red Sea. I understand that. So let's give another piece of argument to put into this. Mount Sinai, according to the 4th chapter of Galatians, verse 25, where he says, and I'm going to read verse 24 and 25, so you'll get it right, get a little more context. Which things contain an allegory, for these women are two covenants, one from Mount Sinai, bearing children under bondage, which is Hagar. Now this Hagar, is Mount Sinai in Arabia, in answer to the Jerusalem that now is, for she is in bondage with her children. So the Mount Sinai, of which the law of Moses was given, is in Arabia. And of course, what we call the Sinai Peninsula today was never part of Arabia. Now, why would that Gulf of, body of water, where we've talked about the Gulf of Aqaba, what's called the Gulf of Aqaba today, why would it be called the Red Sea? In Genesis 25, verses 25 through 30, the name Edom means red. And so Edom, it was on Edom's coast. And of course, that's laid out in the two passages we just read in 1 Kings 9 and 2 Chronicles 8. 9:26 and 8:17, and 9:25 to 27 in 2 Chronicles 8:17. And so Mount Sinai is in Arabia, but what we call the Sinai Peninsula, there's no evidence that it was ever part of Arabia. Again, we're arguing from ignorance again. But what was called Arabia, and when Paul wrote this, was not the Sinai Peninsula. Because the Sinai Peninsula was part of Egypt at that time. All the historical evidence showed that it was part of Egypt. The Sinai Peninsula was never part of Arabia. There's no evidence there ever was. And of course, the Red Sea was Edom's Sea. And this was Stephen Rudd, I mentioned him, I believe, last week, published an excellent work on some of these matters, which I have referenced in the book here. It's a fairly expensive book, but it's very thorough and very helpful. And of course, you spend a little money getting it, but it's an excellent work. So the Israeli archaeologist was looking in what is called the Sinai Peninsula, looking in the wrong place. But he's not going to find this archaeological evidence because he looked in the wrong place. I can look all I want to for the Liberty Bell. If I look in Canada, I'm not going to find it. Okay, I just won't find it there. It's in Pennsylvania. Another piece of evidence, and we'll go there, And I'll have you to read with me, if you will, in Deuteronomy 8, verse 4. There's the fact that neither their shoes nor their clothing wore out. Deuteronomy 8, 4. Thy raiment waxeth not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Now, the term foot swell means the shoes didn't wear out. That's the interpretive meaning by the commentators. So their clothing didn't wear out, and probably their shoes didn't wear out. And it's possible their pottery and other things, tools, didn't break. And archaeologists look for pottery and various tools that have been broken and discarded. And that's what they're looking for. And so if these things didn't break, didn't wear out, they won't be there to be found. And of course, he looked in the wrong place to begin with. So he looked in the wrong place, and we may not see any of these things because they just didn't wear out and didn't break. There wouldn't be anything to be discarded to leave archaeological evidence. So we know the clothing didn't wear out, would be any discarded clothing or shoes, and it's possible their pottery didn't break or wear out either. Infidels, atheists, agnostics, once claimed that the Bible had error in it because it mentioned the Hittite nation. The word Hittite is found in 37 verses in the Old Testament. And the word Hittites, plural, is found in 10 verses. That makes a total of 47 verses where either Hittite or Hittites is mentioned in the Old Testament. The argument of the atheists and skeptics at this time was, if archaeologists have found evidence of the existence of the Hittite nation existed. Well, that's certainly an axiomatic truth. That's certainly true. If they found it, evidence of it, then it existed. Assuming that it's good, solid, sound evidence. And so the Hittite nation existed, they found evidence of it. And then they said, well, they hadn't found evidence of it. Well, that was true up until around 1876. And so they argued then that the Hittite nation didn't exist. Well, of course, it's a logical fallacy denying the antecedent. And it also is an appeal to ignorance. All right? This fact that I'm ignorant of evidence doesn't mean there's no evidence there. I can't find evidence of where my great-great-great-grandfather was buried. All right? But I'm satisfied he lived, and he was probably buried. Okay? So the fact that I can't find his grave doesn't mean he didn't have a grave. He might have been buried. He might not have been buried. All right? Of course, this argument commits two fallacies: denying the antecedent, which we've already laid out, and appealing to ignorance, which we'll lay out in chapter 10. Extra biblical evidence was found later for the existence of the Hittite nation in 1876 by A.H. Sayce, and you can look this name up and find information about him. And now then, the evidence is widespread that these people existed. Some people commit this fallacy also. And of course, they never, had egg on their face, we'd say today, but it didn't bother them. They just shook it off, went right on, made other arguments of the same nature. All right? I hear members of the church that are what I call liberals, and they're very loose in their interpretation of the Bible. They make this argument: the scriptures explicitly prohibit Act X, and Act X is forbidden. Well, that's axiomatic. If there's an explicit prohibition of something, then it's forbidden. That's certainly true. But they're arguing basically the only way God forbids something is explicit prohibition. And I believe that to be false. We'll lay that out as we develop this in this course. Scriptures do not explicitly prohibit Act X. So it's not prohibited explicitly, therefore Act X is not forbidden. Again, the argument denies the antecedent. Let's take our antecedent here, lay it out, Everything before the word then, I've highlighted there, there's your antecedent. Then they come down here and they say the scriptures and they add the word not. And so we have the word not here that they've added to it. And that's the same as the antecedent up there. They denied it. And then, of course, then they denied the consequent, claim they've disproven the consequent. And of course, that's a logical fallacy. The usual response it entails is the Bible does not say it, doesn't say it, they're not to do it. Does not say not to do it. It doesn't say not to do it. What they really should say is the Bible doesn't explicitly say not to do it, because they're arguing and reasoning that only explicit prohibitions are binding as prohibitions. It has to be an explicit "thou shalt not" before it to not be binding, right? To be obligated for us not to do it. They were using the word "say," and in their argument here doesn't say. They're using that word in an ambiguous manner. Now we'll talk about ambiguity later. It'll be an important point here. What's called equivocating. Now, what that means is they have taken the word and given it different meanings, right? So they're equivocating. They're giving that word more than one meaning, a different meaning in their argument, and so it changes meaning. Changes horse in the middle of the stream, we say. Here's another common argument that contains the fallacy of denying the antecedent, and that would be if the scriptures explicitly state. Let's go down all the way down to here. There's your antecedent. So we take their antecedent. If the scriptures explicitly state that others than the apostle work miracles before Acts 6, then it's true that others than the apostle work miracles before Acts 6. This is an axiomatic premise, right? And so they don't explicitly state it. Therefore, the apostle didn't work miracles. Well, and they deny the consequent over here. Well, that's not necessarily true. They don't include the word explicitly usually, but I've added it in. And so that's really what they're saying. The word "say," they've used the word "say," and or the word "state," they've used it in an ambiguous manner as well. So they've committed another fallacy, which we'll get to later. All right. I admit that both the major and minor premises are axiomatic, self-evident truth. That is, that the scriptures do not explicitly, if they explicitly state that other than the apostle work miracles before Acts 6, then other than the apostle work miracles, that's certainly true. It's axiomatic, self-evident. And the scriptures do not explicitly state that other than the apostle work miracles before Acts 6. This is axiomatic too. But that doesn't necessarily prove the conclusion to be true because of the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Right? Now, we don't prove that, and it doesn't prove anything. It's an invalid argument, and all invalid arguments are unsound. It also has, for two reasons, it has the ambiguous word, that is, it's subject to more than one interpretation, state, and you could state something explicitly or implicitly, all right? And two, it contains the fallacy, logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. Now, are there questions up to this point anybody has? All right. We have a number of examples in my books here, and I'll highlight it for you right here. I have a number of examples in my books, and this is from my flood book, first edition. This is from my Holy Spirit Volume 1, first edition. Second edition, I'm sorry. This is from my Holy Spirit Volume 2, and that will be the first edition. And then Fox 2007 would be my Great Commission book, page 61. My Role of Women, I've combined all of those into a combined volume. and the combined volume, which all of you have a copy, electronic copy of it. These are the pages that's found there. Now we've taken examples of denying the antecedent, a logical fallacy, a very serious logical fallacy. Are there any questions anyone has before I go to the next fallacy? Okay. All right. The next fallacy is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. All right. Here is Barker's 1980 edition of Barker, affirming the consequent. Now, remember this, when I quote someone, if it's in bold print or some special print, it was in that print in the original, unless I tell you otherwise. Because I'm not going to highlight stuff and I put highlighted or emphasis MRF, put something to that effect if I put it in there. So Barker had affirming the consequent in bold print in his book. A form of reasoning in which one premise is a conditional, that's an if-then statement, and the other premise is the same as the consequent of that conditional. This form of reasoning is not deductively valid. According to Barker, he's correct, page 320. This fallacy is committed when the consequent is affirmed, even if it's true, and then a claim is made that it proves the antecedent is true. And it's the commonly committed fallacy. The fallacy has the form Fs, then N. N is true, therefore S is true. All right? Or if this in symbolic form, Fs, then, this arrow means then, N. N is true. And the three dots is the word therefore S is true. So this is symbolic right here, then symbols right here, here, and here. This is in the words. And I've used S and N because S is sufficient, N is necessary. And I've used those letters again and again. That's what I'll be using throughout the book. And now that's the form of it. Now let's go to another example of it. And this is from the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And this is Copy. Now, Copy is another logic book that I've used and leaned on pretty heavily. Copy wrote about affirming the consequent. Now, remember, this is our second major fallacy, a logical fallacy in relating to conditional syllogisms. The first one is denying the antecedent. One must not confuse, and here's Copy, not confuse starting right here. One must not confuse the valid form modus ponens, Fs, then N, S is true, therefore N is true, with clearly invalid form displayed by the following argument. Here's an argument he gives it illustrated. If Bacon wrote Hamlet, then Bacon was a great writer, because whoever wrote Hamlet's a great writer, right? So if he wrote Hamlet, he's a great writer. Bacon was a great writer, therefore he wrote Hamlet. Well, that's not true. Hamlet was written by Shakespeare, but Bacon was indeed a great writer. So again, the affirming the consequent to be true, and it is, then that doesn't necessarily prove the antecedent is true. It doesn't prove Bacon wrote Hamlet just because he's a great writer. See how foolish that kind of reasoning is? All right. This argument differs from modus ponens. Mode is mood or operation, or mode, and ponens is affirmative, okay? That's Latin, in that its categorical premises affirms the consequent. Its premise affirms the consequent rather than the antecedent of the conditional premise. Any argument of this form is said to commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Right? So it's a logical fallacy. It's a fallacy in form. Now let's illustrate it with an illustration. Here's an argument that contains a logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. First premise, if John is a citizen of Iowa, then John is a citizen of the United States. Well, this is axiomatic. Why? Because you have to be a citizen of the United States to be a citizen of Iowa. Now, so that's necessary to be a citizen of the United States for you to be a citizen of Iowa. It's sufficient if you're a citizen of Iowa to prove you're a citizen of the United States. Why? Because all Iowa citizens are also U.S. citizens. So we argued John is a citizen of the United States. And I know a John who's a citizen of the United States. I have a friend who's named John, and he's a citizen of the United States, but he's not a citizen of Iowa. John is a citizen of Iowa. That doesn't prove it, because he could be a citizen of a bunch of other states or territories. And so there are 50 states and then several territories, all of which would make you a citizen of the United States. So again, the form of the argument is such that he affirms the consequent. He affirms this: John is a citizen of the United States, therefore he must be a citizen of Iowa. Well, that's not true. All right? The affirmation of the consequent does not prove the antecedent is true. The consequent might be true for reasons other than the antecedent. For example, John might be a citizen of Maine or another U.S. state or territory. In this example we cited, the first premise is true, the second premise might be true, but both being true doesn't necessarily prove the conclusion to be true. And they're not linked, they're not related. The following argument contains the fallacy of affirming the consequent. If John is saved, then John has faith. Well, that's true. John believes. We can show from Scripture that's true. John has faith, see? It's necessary for him to have faith in order to be saved. So they argue, well, he has faith, therefore they conclude that he must be saved. Salvation by faith alone. This is one of the several fallacies of reason that some of our religious neighbors commit. And again, it commits that logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. Calvinism might claim that we're reversing the sufficient necessary conditions. They would frame the argument this way: if John believes, then John is saved. John believes, he has faith, therefore he's saved. They'd say this is sufficient, faith is sufficient to bring about salvation. That sounds good on the surface. But now we remember the antecedent must be a sufficient condition, the consequent a necessary condition. So it implies if this consequent is necessary before the antecedent can be true, then you have to be saved before you believe, if that's true. And of course, the Calvinist doesn't believe that. And he has to be saved before he believes. And so that would be logically what would be required. This is necessary for this to be true. You have to be saved to believe. Well, that wouldn't work. And so I don't have the argument reversed. This is the way this is the way they think it, but their reasoning is bad. Okay. Now, Hurley wrote, on the other hand, event A is said to be a necessary condition for event B whenever B cannot occur without A. Now, right here, right, the necessary condition is the consequent. So this antecedent can't occur here without the prerequisite of being saved. In other words, you can't believe without being saved. You have to be saved before you can believe. And of course, that's certainly not true. Okay? This is one of the fallacious arguments lodged by certain atheist agnostics or skeptics. Now we'll go through this and a couple more, and then we'll end the class. One of their arguments is atheists, agnostics, and or skeptics of various sorts. If organic macroevolution, I use the word macro, I believe in microevolution. I believe God put within the genes of animals and plants the ability to adapt within certain limitations. And we see some adaptation, but there are limits to it. And so microevolution is animals such as bears may have white offspring, and they may have different characteristics of them, and they will become polar bears. And some other bears of that same family of bears would become grizzly bears and others would be brown bears or white bears or black bears, other colors and shades of bears. So, but they're all still bears. For organic microevolution, this is amoeba to man. And this is one thing changing into another. A dinosaur turning into a bird, for example. If organic microevolution is true, if it's true, then there should be similarities in anatomies of various animals. Well, that would certainly be true. If their proposition, their proposal that microevolution occurs, then there ought to be similarities in the anatomies of various animals. Well, that would certainly be true. Then they argue, well, there's similarities in certain anatomies, certain animals, various animals. Therefore, organic macroevolution is true. Now look at the form of the argument. What they've done is they've taken this consequent, there should be similarities, and they say there are similarities. They've affirmed the consequent. Again, the argument proves nothing. It contains that of fallacy of affirming the consequent. But so many people don't know how to reason right that they don't even see that they've been snookered. They've been fooled by this fallacious argument. It's a common fallacy that atheists and agnostics and skeptics make. They don't explicitly make this argument in this form, but they make a claim that similarities in the anatomies of various animals is evidence of organic microevolution. Well, that's basically that's basically the argument. Similarities in anatomies proves that organic microevolution occurred. That's basically the argument that we have right up here. That's what that is. That's the argument reduced to a logical format. So my counter-argument, I make a counter-argument to prove their case is wrong. And the skeptic, agnostic, atheist can't accept this one. And I'll make the argument. If special creation by God is true, then there should be similarities in anatomies of various animals. Well, why would that be true? Because God would use the most efficient way of creating things. And animals might need a backbone. A backbone is very efficient for animals to function. And so many animals would have vertebrae, and other animals would be structured with different structures. So special creation by God is true, then there should be similarities in anatomies of various animals because the pattern works. A heart circulatory system and breathing system, and a bunch of animals would have these systems of breathing and circulatory systems. And there are similarities in anatomies of various animals. They will all have the same pattern, but they're close. And so my argument affirms the consequent. It's the same basic argument they make. Therefore, special creation by God, it must be true. I'm arguing exactly the way they argue. And of course, they can't accept the conclusion special creation by God is true. And of course, his first premise is true. Second premise is true. But the conclusion is not necessarily true, although I believe it's true, but I have to prove it by other means. Okay. Now, let's look at this. God used the same basic structure to create various organisms. The omniscient creator used the best system for whatever organism he created. Frequently, the best system was the same pattern for many organisms. A four-chambered heart for many animals worked well. There's other reasons for 2 and 3 and 4 chamber hearts. And they had different reasons for them. They functioned differently. So the creator used the best system. The creator, and I use that in all caps, notice there. I'm talking about God. Used the best system for whatever organism he created. And frequently the best system would be the same pattern. Now, here's another argument. He will say that we reverse the argument, transpose the sufficient necessary conditions. And they would say, well, if there are similarities in the anatomies of various animals, then organic macroevolution is true, right? Then they argue there are similarities. Well, that's certainly true. Therefore, organic microevolution is true. Well, now, the problem with this is they've begged the question up here. All right? Remember this, the antecedent has to be a sufficient condition. All right? So that means, and let's look at what that means, and I'll get back to this. I want to look at the necessary and sufficient conditions as Copey defines them. Now, keep in mind, antecedent is sufficient and the consequent is necessary, okay? And so it must be a sufficient condition. The consequent must be necessary, all right? And this is critical. I'm going to repeat the meaning of these words. We've already given them before. A necessary condition for the occurrence of specified event is a circumstance in whose absence the event cannot occur. So if that consequent doesn't occur, then it cannot be true, all right? Organic microevolution, if it's not true, then this up here, this antecedent wouldn't be true. That's what it's saying. Well, the antecedent fits in with special creation. There are similarities in various animals, and then we'd expect that with creation as well. See? So again, is consequent doesn't fit. Absence of that consequent, it cannot occur. The consequent organic evolution is true is not the necessary for the antecedent to be true. Special creation by an omniscient creator, omniscient God, also would cause there to be similarities in the various anatomies of various animals. Here's my counter argument. If there are similarities in anatomies of various animals, then special creation by God is true. And again, the atheist can't accept this, but it's the same form as his argument. There are similarities, therefore special creation by God is true. I don't claim this as proving it, but I'm just arguing the same way he argued to show the fallacy of his reasoning. They have the same major premise, and it's true in the same middle term. There are similarities, and that's true, yet they draw two conclusions that are mutually exclusive. If special creation by God is mutually exclusive to organic microevolution, then this argument has some kind of flaw. Of course, some people would argue theistic evolution, theistic organic microevolution. But in my book on the flood, I showed enough evidence, and there have been good men who have also shown that this has a flaw in it, that organic theistic evolution did not occur. The old adage, what proves too much proves nothing. Any questions? All right. We've gotten about to where I want to stop right here. But let me point out here, I'll make one more quick argument and we'll be through. We'll stop right here. The same line of reasoning also falsifies other arguments that the agnostics, atheists, and skeptics make, and theistic evolutionists make, embryonic recapitulation, etc. Other arguments would fit in there, and embryonic recapitulation, as we see this. That will pick up with this right here, cosmic microwave background radiation. We'll pick that up with next week. Do you have any questions? Anybody? All right, we'll stop recording.